good morning or good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I would like to welcome you all to the last Patient Engagement Open Forum PEOF session for 2021 with a theme, Global Lens on Evolving Patient Engagement Landscape, co-creating PEOF 2022. I know there are a few more people joining us, so we'll just wait. We'll just give it about a minute to have more people join us, and we will get started. Okay, so welcome again. My name is Awo Osayanto, and I'm a director. Actually, if you move on to the next slide, I'm a director with Faster Cures, a center of the Milken Institute. I'll be your moderator for this session. At Faster Cures, we are focused on working with our partners to build a patient-centric system where science is accelerated, unnecessary barriers are addressed, and life-saving treatments get to patients as rapidly as possible. Engaging patients in our work is really key. So I'm really pleased to be a part of this PEOF discussion. Next slide. I'm sure most of you are familiar with PEOF and have participated in some of the sessions this year. But for the few that are new to the forum, I wanted to provide some background on the forum. So PEOF provides a platform for multiple stakeholders, including the patient community, to work together in driving stronger patient engagement. In 2021, the PEOF sessions were held virtually in recognition of the current pandemic that we're in. A hallmark of the forum is that it fosters collaboration and co-creation while breaking down the silos that are so endemic to the patient engagement work. I would also like to recognize the PEOF organizers. Three of them, the PatientFocused Medicines Development, PFMD, European Patients Academy on Therapeutic Innovations, UPATI, and European Patients Forum, EPF. On the next slide, we have a few housekeeping items for you to note. First is that we ask that you be present and engaged. Secondly, mute your microphones, to minimize any background noise. And we also encourage that you provide questions, comments, or feedback anytime during the presentations using the Q&A function. I'll talk a little bit about the Q&A function on the next slide. But I also wanted to note that the session is being recorded and will be made available online. And finally, enjoy the workshop and let's make it interesting together. Be engaged and let's just make it successful together. On the next slide, I wanted to point out where you can find the Q&A function. It's in the toolbar of the Zoom, in the Zoom toolbar, just as shown on the slide. All the questions that are posed will be shown with the name of the person that's posing the question. And feel free to just upvote a question instead of repeating it if you have a similar one in mind. Also note that we may not be able to get to all the questions on this in this live session with our panelists, but we will try to get to as many as time will allow. And as with any live meeting, we ask that you be respectful so that we can freely engage with each other. Next slide. So the goal for this session is to take some time to reflect on the current patient engagement landscape, while also looking ahead at possible trends and directions for 2022. And to do that, we've invited some preeminent experts to offer their reflection. I will turn it over to the experts, to our speakers, to briefly introduce themselves. Can we start with you, Teresa?
Yes, hello, I'm Teresa Mullen, Associate Director of Strategic Initiatives at the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. I'm really pleased to be on this part of this panel today. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Next, we have Stuart.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Stuart Falkner. I'm calling from the Department of Primary Healthcare at Oxford University. I come at this from being heavily involved in the sort of brainchild of PEOF, which was the Paradigm Consortium and I've also been involved in the sort of working committee to make the PEOF happen. So yeah, excited to be here today and reflect upon where we've been and where we're going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. We also have Randall Ruta.
Thank you. Great to be with all of you. My name is Randall Ruta. I am here as the CEO of the National Health Council in the United States. We're a membership organization with all of the leading patient groups that are US-based, many with international partners, as well as all of the stakeholders that are concerned about patient engagement and patient health. It's a real pleasure to join you today.
Thank you, Randall. And finally, we have Tony.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Tony Hoos. I currently serve as the Chief Medical Officer for a genomics company. I'm also one of the founders of PFMD, and I've been passionate about patient involvement and evolving the systems through doing that for probably the last 20 years or so. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Tony. So we'll hear from our speakers shortly. We'll hear the remarks shortly, but I wanted to take a moment to review the activities and reach of PEOF on the next slide in 2021. So this year really was a decisive one for PEOF activities. There were 4 PEOF sessions or events, one in each quarter of the year. Each of those events spanned 2 days, and each of those days had 2 sessions for a total of 16 sessions for stakeholders to engage on a variety of topics. The events attracted about over 2,000 audience members representing multiple stakeholders, as you can see on the left hand of the slide. The top 10 stakeholders really are very diverse, but as you can see, heavy representation from pharma, patient community, and researchers. PEOF sessions also attracted global participation, primarily from Europe, but with good representation from North America and Asia as well. On the next slide, you'll see some of the themes that were covered in the 16 sessions that I just mentioned. The themes really were designed to kind of emphasize continuity in order to really create meaningful conversations that would then feed into tangible projects. And so the patient experience and patient experience data was one that transcended all the sessions. And through the end of the year, we added on sub themes as we saw necessary and as those themes were identified as important to cover. As PEOF is a co-creation platform, we are really looking to you all today to provide your input in proposing topics that you would like to see covered in 2022. And we'll do that using Group Map, a tool called Group Map. And on the next slide, just want to talk briefly about Group Map. So we use this to collect insights, and actually, why don't we go ahead and use Group Map to just learn who all is on the call today with us. And so you will see the Group Map link posted in the chat box. Please go ahead and click on that link. And for best performance, we recommend that you use a computer so that you can have the Zoom window as well as the Group Map window open simultaneously, concurrently. And so once you click on the Group Map link, you will have to enter your email address in order to enter the survey, where you can indicate which stakeholder group that you're representing. So we see results coming in. Let's give another minute. So if you're having problems with the survey link, please just let us know in the chat box and we can help out with that as well. So we'll give another minute as roughly half of the participants have indicated have provided their response. I think the group that we have assembled is very reflective of previous participation, where we see we see pharma as well, patient organizations, researchers, We have some patients, patient advocates on the call with us. We have a caregiver and other participants. So please continue to provide your responses whilst we move on to the next part of the program. And thank you all so much for participating. And actually a quick note before we move on, please do not close the group map link, as we will be using that later in the session to get your input on the topics that should be covered. We'll also provide the link again, but it's easier to just keep it up until that point. So now I want to turn it over to our speakers. First up, I'll invite Dr. Teresa Mullen to share about the work that FDA is doing in leading the charge for patient engagement through its PFDD, the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative, and providing guidance to industry and patients groups. So Teresa, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Ewo. Thank you very much. And again, very happy to be here. And I'd like to go to my next slide, please. So in the next few minutes, I want to give you a fairly quick overview of the patient-focused drug development evolving landscape from FDA's perspective, and in particular from the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research perspective. And so go next slide, please. And so I'm going to cover a couple of topics in this time, talk about patient-focused drug development, how it's evolved, the meetings that we've been conducting and patient groups have been conducting, the guidance documents that we have underway, and some other programs that we're developing to try to really make this effort sustainable. Sustainability being and quality being some of our themes at this point. Next slide, please. And so this gives you just a quick sense of the trajectory of patient-focused drug development at FDA. Before 2012, there really was no active systematic effort, but in 2012 and 2013, with the reauthorization of the prescription drug user fee program, and in the US, that's a very important source of funding for our drug review work. And we make a commitment to various enhancements over 5-year periods with that vehicle. And so one of the commitments we made in 2012 was that we would conduct 20 meetings with patients to understand their perspective on their disease and the treatments available. These meetings were incredibly powerful for us, and we built on that and expanded it to have patients be able to conduct very much the same kind of meeting, but it would go beyond FDA's limited bandwidth so we could hear from more and more groups. And then that led to our trying to basically develop a series of documents that would, guidance documents that would really help to make sure that we had good quality data coming in that we could use to the maximum extent in our drug development for companies and regulatory decision-making for FDA. Next slide, please. So we have these meetings, and just to quickly go over how they're structured, they're public meetings focused on a specific disease area, and patients are the ones that do the talking. Patients and perhaps their family members if they're very close to the patient's experience as well and may augment what the patients are telling us. Everyone else is there in listening mode, including FDA and any sponsors that may come to the meeting. We ask what are the symptoms that have the greatest impact? What are people doing now for their current treatment regimen? How well is that working? What would they consider ideal in treating their condition? And then asking about factors that might affect their decision to take a medicine. You know, some probing of trade-offs of risk that they'd be willing to accept for benefits, and what would affect their willingness to participate in trials. We produce a report that tries to faithfully capture what we hear in these meetings. We call it the Voice of the Patient report, and these are on our website. Next slide, please. And so FDA conducted over 20, we've had 24 of these meetings, the most intense period being 2013 through 2017, and we've had fewer since then, but that's been really more than augmented by the efforts of patient groups. And on the next slide, you'll see that the over 50 meetings that patient groups have had in their disease area. The structure of these meetings is very similar to the ones that FDA conducted. FDA attends these meetings. My staff actually help and work with the patient groups to try to, in their planning of the meetings. And when they produce a report from the meeting and send us a link, we will put that link on our website to try to provide a sort of one-stop shopping, if you will, for people to find these resources and refer to them later. Our reviewers consider the information and what they hear in these meetings to be really valuable and provide them insights into the disease and how patients feel about their condition and what matters when they're looking at and reviewing applications, marketing applications. Next slide, please. And so to really even go further with this, build on that qualitative information that we've been collecting in these meetings and that patients have been collecting in their meetings and others, we wanted to issue this guidance series to give people a better sense of what is needed to really take it further and maybe collect information during clinical trials to further sort of understand whether a treatment is beneficial in those areas that patients indicated were most important to them. So measures and tools that are going to be valid and reliable, thus fit for purpose, and suitable for regulatory decision-making. The data that comes from that would be usable in regulatory decision-making. So that's where this guidance series sort of, what motivated it. Next slide, please. And so here's the series of guidance that we're undertaking. We're a little delayed in some of these guidances because of the pandemic and other workload that has emerged from pandemic response. But the series are first to how to collect comprehensive and representative input, methods to use to understand what is most important to patients that might be affected by a medical treatment. The third being trying to figure out what sorts of measures might be best used to capture that information in trials. And then the fourth is going to focus more on defining endpoints in trials and understanding and defining what's meaningful change to the patient in terms of those measures. And so the first two are out. The third guidance there, we hope to have issued in the coming year, and the fourth one as well. And that's the progression. Next slide, please. And so in addition to this, that developing good measures can be labor intensive, expensive. And so to try to increase sustainability, FDA is also undertaking a grant program to try to develop and support the development of measures that we will make available at nominal or no cost, or that the developers will make available at no cost. And these are focused on migraine, acute pain in infants and children, young children, physical functioning across a range of conditions, fluid overload and nephrotic syndrome, and communication ability, particularly in the pediatric population. And so those are all efforts underway right now. Next slide, please. And this is also toward the sustainability of these efforts. And the ICH, the International Council for Harmonization, we worked with EMA a year or so ago to develop a proposed paper, and that paper, reflection paper on patient-focused drug development, has been endorsed by the ICH Assembly, and it covers a range of opportunities for including the patient's perspective and improving development and decision-making as a result of that. The paper also proposes guidance in two areas. One is a guideline on the methods that could be used to measure what matters in clinical trials. Those clinical outcome assessments, including patient-reported outcomes, clinician-reported, performance-based, and observational outcomes. And the second guidance here, or guideline, would be focused on preference methods. So patient preference elicitation and those kinds of methodologies and where they might be used and how to best do those kinds of studies. So with that, I'd like to summarize by saying there are 3 points I'd like to make about the landscape. Well, the first is that there is increasing global recognition of the importance of hearing the patient's perspective on disease and treatments. Companies are increasingly engaging patient groups in the context of their development programs, and this is offering great potential. but we also need to respect the use of patients' time and make the best use of it. We need to make sure that their experience is collected in ways that can be used to the fullest extent in drug development and decision-making, not wasting any opportunity. And we need to minimize duplicative requests for patients' time and input across multiple efforts and development programs, and so that we can make this sustainable and maximize the impact. With that, I'll turn it back to Awo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for that presentation and for highlighting the immense and important work that FDA has done in the last few years to really drive forward this effort and provide the platform for especially patients to provide their feedback. I know that at Fast and Curious, we did put out guidance with patient organizations that were looking to host their own PFDD meetings. So that's been a welcome, like that avenue has been really welcomed by the patient community. I did want to pick on just one point and ask that you made and ask about in engaging patients, especially from the sponsor perspective, how can we ensure that we are gathering the patient's perspective and experience and their input in such a way that it can be used in the fullest extent in drug development and in regulatory decision making?
Well, thank you for that question, Awo. Well, I think some of the things that were pointed to in my presentation, in fact, and the ICH work that is forthcoming, and that is to we're developing standards and guidelines to make sure that people know what's the best way to produce good quality. Because if the evidence is collected in a way that's valid and reliable, as I said, and the measures are valid and reliable, then it can be used to the fullest extent in decision making. So I think that those are really key. The reflection paper and globally, those documents that'll be forthcoming through ICH will be helpful in standardizing it, and kind of, because trials are multi-regional and development programs are often global, it's going to be important to have those standards be globally based if possible. And that's, I think, what we'll see in the next couple of years. We'll start to see that work getting really moving. Over.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And one of the participants just posted, mentioned a point about compensating patients for their time and lived experience as well. And I know this is a topic that PEOF has covered in one of the earlier sessions. And we will revisit some of the issues that you brought up later after the presentations if we have more time. I wanted to remind everyone that to please feel free to enter your comments and questions for the panelists in the chat box anytime at all, and we'll be keeping an eye on those questions as they come in and addressing them later with the panelists. So next up is Stuart Falkner. And so Stuart, I know that there are emergent trends that are shaping the patient engagement landscape, and one of them is technological innovation. And you've given a lot of thought to considerations for how we move forward with leveraging health technology in this space. So I'll give you the platform now to share your thoughts that you have on this and other topics.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going a bit rogue on this. I've got no slides, so I'm just going to talk. Again, do stop me if I go over. So yeah, when I was sort of reflecting on this year, I had a look back at some of the early sessions that we had on sort of digital literacy and health literacy, and it really got me thinking that those two things, digital literacy and sort of health literacy, both in sort of development of health technology, but also in the broader healthcare sector. While they're not necessarily synonymous, they do need to be considered hand in hand. That they really shouldn't be sort of taken together in isolation there. When we think about the evolution of technology and the intersection that technology has with digital and health literacy, we really do need to think about looking at those together in terms of things like wearables, in terms of apps, digital health, and in terms of sort of co-designing the products and services that are required across the board there. And that evolution, I think has been sort of amplified over the last couple of years. So, you know, it's a wealth of really good examples of wearables and apps. And so I think that would be my first point, that those two really do need to be considered hand in hand. We shouldn't sort of go down the route of them being siloed. But actually, I think in terms of understanding that intersection between the digital, the health, and the technology itself is also a really useful point to do some research on there. Which kind of leads me to my sort of second point, when we think, again, back to some of the sessions we had on how we are engaging with youth in developing health technologies. And so I wanted to expand that a bit further, that we really do need to better consider the sort of input and account for the caregiver in this as well, when we think about sort of digital health. And we must remember that the caregiver can be a multitude of people covering a multitude of ages. It could be somebody like myself, looking after either a child or an elderly patient. It could be a youth, again, looking after an elderly family member or a friend, but it also likely could be at the other end of the spectrum, you know, an elderly person looking after their partner or spouse. And all of those will have different levels of digital maturity and health maturity as well. And so I think we need to be very careful moving forward that we can account from those different perspectives, but also account for those different spectrums of health and digital literacy as we develop products and services. But also we have to remind ourselves that the caregiver, they still have a key role in using, interfacing with the technologies that we develop. And in fact, in some instances, they may be interfacing with those technology as much as, or possibly more than, the patient themselves. So whether they are the one responsible for injecting a particular sort of drug, whether they're the one interacting with the glucose monitor that's attached to the patient, or possibly even the one that's trying to read and understand and make a decision on a barrage of information that's coming out from the wearable device or app that they're interacting with. So I think we need to think very careful about those moving forward. So that's point two. And then my final point is perhaps a little bit more controversial. Again, I look back at a lot of the co-creation sessions with those sort of interactive whiteboards that we had, and great sessions, really good. But I noticed quite a few times that there were calls for more guidance, you know, for condition X or certain sort of patient populations. And I would push back against that a bit. I'm not sure we necessarily always need more guidance. I think we really need to evolve into more of a learning ecosystem here, and really use the knowledge we have as the community we have on this call, but the broader sort of patient engagement ecosystem. And when I think about sort of evolving to a learning ecosystem, that's really sharing those learnings when patient engagement is done well and when it's not done well. We've seen some really fantastic case examples of where patient engagement has been really good and it's worked and it's fulfilled its purpose. The only thing that I'm concerned is that you know, outside of that, those initiatives, they sort of disappear off into the ether. We never hear from them again. So my call would be to really make sure that as patient engagement is being done, where those case examples start to evolve, that those case examples are written up. So this is now with my proper academic hat on. They're written up and where possible published, you know, with patients in a sort of journal, so that others can then benefit from those experiences and learnings. And if that sort of formal publication is not possible in a standard journal, that we use some of those publicly available databases that we know exist, you know, the ones that UPATI and PFMD have, and those case examples are written up with enough detail that others can learn from it. And so when I talk about detail, I'm really talking about putting some detail into what was the approach, what was the methodology used, what methods did you use, who was involved, when were they involved, what were your outcomes, how did you measure success, and be honest and transparent, what worked and what didn't work. And I think having that better consolidation of what works and how it works really allows the rest of the community to really learn from that and build off that, so we can really evolve together, and there's that uplift together. So those are my 3 points, rather brief, but I'll leave it there and open for questions.
Oh, you raised some really great points, Stuart, and thank you for that. The point about better guidance needed, I think that's one that we've heard repeatedly from our partners that we've engaged with, and even a recent forum that we had at Plastic Cures. I wanted to actually get your thoughts briefly on, especially since this session is focused on looking at the global lens for patient engagement. Your thoughts on the difference between EU and US regulations in the medtech space, with GDPR providing arguably very stringent kind of privacy protections for patients, and HIPAA providing some privacy protection, but there's still a substantial difference. What should we be thinking about going into 2022 in order to effectively leverage technological innovation globally?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a really good question. I think it was something that sort of Begonia brought up in her session yesterday. When we think about sort of particularly around sort of medical devices, the regulatory landscape in medical devices is sort of undergoing a bit of an evolution at the moment, really trying to sort of improve the sort of pre-market sort of data that needs to be collected, but also the post-market data around sort of measuring safety as well. So I think when I compare to sort of the US, I think you know the patient involvement and the requirements there are quite strong in the US. In the EU, I think we're getting there. I think my concern is that perhaps while sort of small and large companies are perhaps grappling with some of these changes to the regulation in Europe, but particularly around medical devices, that potentially sort of the patient engagement bit is kind of put on the back burner or left behind. So that would be my ask, is that while that sort of evolution is happening, while companies are really trying to work through these new processes and new requirements, that they really do take patients along and with that, and use their expertise and input as they develop their products and test them as well.
Thank you very much. And I just want to I see the questions coming in from participants, and I just want to let you know that we're keeping an eye on them, and we will get to them after we've had a chance to hear from all our speakers. And so please do keep them coming. Thank you very much for that again, Stuart, for your perspective. I want to turn now to Randall. I know that NHC and your members have been focused, patient engagement is a key issue area, and you have been focused on some priority issues. And so can you talk a bit about where your efforts have been and where you and your member organizations see opportunities for advancing the work in the next year?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Oh, I really appreciate that introduction. You know, the National Health Council has 145 health and health-related organizations, businesses in our membership, including most of the leading US-based patient organizations. And other members include health-related associations, nonprofit organizations with an interest in health, providers, researchers, family caregivers, businesses representing biopharma, device, diagnostic, generic, and payer organizations. So it's that community that we really draw from to advance the ideas that I'll share today. And we were fortunate that earlier this week, the National Health Council's Board of Directors approved a new strategic plan for 2022, 23, and 24 that establishes optimal patient health, patient centricity, and health equity as core areas of focus. Our plan is a welcome and timely call to action for us all. And the National Health Council is a driving force in patient engagement, supporting patient-focused drug development and patient-centric decision-making. So today's discussion will shape and inspire us in the year ahead. Next slide. So next year, we'll celebrate 10 years since the US FDA first established patient-focused drug development, a major milestone. And we believe that the FDA's embrace of patient and patient group engagement is remarkable, significant, and worthy of replication across government and in the private sector. So thank you so much, Teresa and the FDA team. You know, through collaborations across countries and stakeholder groups, we've overcome many of the key barriers that stood in the way of patient engagement, much to what Stuart was just mentioning. In 2015, the National Health Council and the Genetic Alliance partnered to discuss how could we advance the science of patient engagement and remove barriers. At the time, we identified the following fundamental barriers that hinder meaningful engagement. 3 major categories related to culture, communication, regulatory rules and processes stood out. And to overcome these barriers and advance patient-focused drug development, we have collaborated to share real-life examples of what good looks like in the context of patient-focused drug development, develop formal guidance from the FDA on patient-focused drug development, ensuring that PFDD is science-based and providing the green light to industry that patient engagement is encouraged and expected. We look to develop a patient engagement fair market value calculator that ensures members of patient community are compensated fairly for their contributions and expertise, with legal templates to make it easier for patients and the industry to work together. And we reflect on our efforts to advance patient engagement. To date, we know that we are making indeed real progress. We know that the patient voice is being heard, that there's a focus on patient-centered endpoints. Better and friendly trials are occurring, and information patients can use is being developed for them, and they're benefiting from that. But there are challenges, and that's where I'll be focusing on today, our work in that area. One is the recognition of importance, but still these challenges remain: the lack of high-quality data on the impacts that matter most to patients, the diversity of patients involved in patient engagement and drug development, and patient experience with data that's consistently applied in ways that benefit the patient. So let's look at these areas, and I'll mention 3. Diversity, equity, and inclusion in patient engagement and patient-focused drug development is a major and growing priority in health and society. The premise of PFDD is that we want to develop medicines that better meet the needs of patients. For us to be successful, we need to be sure that we are meeting the needs of all patients, not just those who have traditionally been engaged in drug development or patient advocacy. We need to commit to addressing diversity that looks like age, comorbid conditions, comorbidities, ethnicity, gender, genetics, geographic location, that might be rural, urban, or suburban, health literacy and insurance coverage, race, socioeconomic status, and the severity of the condition that the patient experiences. In patient engagement in all areas of activity, these issues need to be brought forward as we think about holistically involving patients and the patient community in drug development, and then getting those drugs moving toward them and accessible in the marketplace. We need to understand who is it that can help us develop those drugs and then ultimately benefit from those medicines. And we certainly don't want to engage patients in ways that could unintentionally disadvantage any one of those population groups. Next slide, please. So today, there's a wide variation in the metrics used to study health conditions and their treatments, and often misalignment between what's measured and what matters to patients and their families. And this haphazard approach leads to confusion, missed opportunities, and inefficiency. It continues to be a barrier to our shared goals for patient engagement and decisions affecting value and health technology assessment, guidelines development, care delivery, and ultimately shared decision-making. Standardization is needed to help patients target data collection toward the disease and treatment impacts that patients and families report as most important to them. A patient-centered core impact set, PCCIS, is a possible solution. And we've put a tremendous amount of energy into the development of this core impact set framework. A PCCIS is a patient prioritized list of impacts a disease and/or its treatments have on a patient and their family. It's intentionally broad and inclusive. The term impacts include short-term and long-term health outcomes and any other related implications like caregiver or family stresses, economic burden. Since only patients can inform us about what is important to them regarding their health and their lives, the development of a PCCIS system begins by engaging patients and their care partners and families to identify those impacts. But unfortunately, that system does not exist today. But I'm pleased to report that we're far along in bringing that to fruition. So what are the benefits of patient-centered core impact sets as a valuable opportunity to elevate the patient voice? One, starts with what's most important to patients and families to get to the right measures. Two, broadens current thinking from a focus on individual health outcomes or core outcome sets to thinking about all the impacts that are important to patients and families in a standardized way. Also, thirdly, improves alignment among impacts measured in a variety of healthcare and research issues. Characterizing disease from a patient perspective, informing patient-centered care and shared decision-making, selecting measures and endpoints for clinical trial, real-world, and other research studies, comparing findings across these studies, conducting value and health technology assessment and economic modeling, developing and using quality of care measures, and in care provider auditing. And lastly, in guiding regulatory decisions. Our decision, or I should say our vision, is to create a smooth pathway for PCPCIS, patient-centered core impact sets, development by patient groups and their partners. Many of you have been involved in this journey. Patient group consortia, medical product companies, government entities, and others have been engaged. And we envision a blueprint and a toolkit that moves us closer to aligning stakeholders in their understanding of what is important to patients. As we collectively have developed a system to recognize and compensate patients for their engagement with drug development, a fair market value calculator has contributed to this effort. It was mentioned earlier that patients invest a lot in patient engagement, and we need to recognize that and characterize that, and in some ways compensate patients for that. We might be looking at time away from work, transportation, meals and lodging, daycare for family members who need care while the patient is involved with a clinical trial process. All of these are elements that are real to patients and need to be taken into consideration, and in many instances, most instances, some compensation offered. So the fair market value calculator is a way for companies and others to really assess those costs to patients and then determine appropriate compensation. We're excited to have that out there. It's a tool for everyone in this process. And then finally, I want to talk about patient-centered data. It's increasingly collected and shared with regulators and other decision makers, but we need to make sure that there's transparency to ensure that the data is applied consistently and appropriately to guide those decisions, and that these decisions lead to meaningful differences in the experience of patients, their access to appropriate medicines, optimal health outcomes that would result. What's missing previously was a credible method for assessing whether or not decision makers are embracing our vision for patient engagement and to look at the actual experience of patients. A necessary first step is advancing this goal in a truly understanding way for the patient experience, in their words, consistent with their life goals and aspirations. So the National Health Council was pleased to engage many of you in the process of developing a patient experience mapping tool, and that's helping to help researchers engage and document chronic disease experiences before getting a diagnosis and et cetera. This toolbox is available to you now. We're looking to bring that into the field. That will be critically important for us to take these concepts, these research methods, and make them real on behalf of patients. So just know the National Health Council is a ready partner for all involved in this call and going forward, and with trust in science, trust in the work that we're doing, from our level of credibility, we can ensure that the patient experience and the patient outcomes will be different. So thank you so much for including me in this open forum conversation.
Thank you so much, Randall. And you, thank you for sharing the phenomenal work that NHC is doing in creating the patient-centered core impact sets. I know that is a very welcome tool or resource for patient organizations, especially in streamlining their engagement with sponsors, and also having all the different stakeholders be on the same page about the patient's perspective or information that is needed. In the interest of time, I will actually move on to our next speaker, and then we will circle back to some of the questions that we've had. We have a few questions around FDA's engagement and some other topics as well. So I will go ahead and invite our final speaker, Tony, to share his broad reflection on the field of patient engagement, the progress that has been made and opportunities to address the challenges that remain. Johnny?
Thanks a lot, Avo. And again, hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So it's a real honor to be kind of part of that meeting after such distinguished speakers. And I think it's perfectly in order to commend most certainly Teresa and also NHC for their accomplishments and their leadership in this field. Well done. Thank you for that. If you want to move to my first slide, here we go. It's a busy slide. Sorry about that. But I think it's more or less a summarizing slide of what we've heard in the prior conversations. You see, there is kind of a timeline. It starts with 1992. This is about the time when I personally first brought a patient to the FDA discussing study designs. Remember that well, it was in cystic fibrosis. And I think it was an eye-opener for everyone. And you see there were tons of activities that have happened over these years. I think at this stage, it was pretty easy to keep the overview and to kind of stay on track with what was happening. You see a couple of important milestones, both in Europe and in the US, and a couple of pieces were mentioned already, whether it was FDA driven, whether it was UPAT in Europe, DIA has taken some initiatives, IMI and the like. And I would submit to you, if we continue on this journey here, probably around 2020 or so, it's truly accelerated, which tells me a lot of stakeholders have embraced the need and the benefit of engaging patients. And now all of a sudden, we have lots and lots of initiatives popping up, run by many stakeholders across the globe, some in a clear leadership position, and some others perhaps followers. And that, of course, has a couple of consequences. If you show the next slide, I want to talk about that a little bit. You see a lot of bubbles. What do these bubbles do? It's a snapshot, what has happened, what we see in the landscape. And you see players like the FDA, PFDD, the European Medicines Agency, you see all the digital health and data initiatives, you see legal agreements, you see the National Health Council. So there's individual pieces like tools, like plain language summaries, information, how patients can access clinical trial information or can get into clinical trials, measurement of success, fair market value. We talked about the fair market value calculator just a second ago when Randall gave his conversation that's available. So a lot of tools have been created in the landscape. Some are actually pretty universally available. Some are region specific. And then there's this myriad of stakeholders who do something here, all with truly best intent, some with a finite timeline. If you look at Paradigm on the right, center right, this has a beginning and an end, and then we have to make sure that there is continuity. And I think that's a little bit the opportunity and the challenge we have here, with the community having widely embraced the need and the benefit, as I said, of patient engagement, but not necessarily at a sustainable and at a consistent quality level, like Teresa said so eloquently a couple of minutes ago. If you show me the next slide, or show us the next slide, I would submit to you that here, just showing these kind of two arrows that I had on the prior slide, we start running into a gap. And I think Teresa said that very well in her talk as well. So if there's such a high demand for patient engagement, and we all want something, I think we have to start becoming really respectful and very mindful about patients' time, patients' involvements. Do we need to come up with some standards so that there's consistency, that we don't redo things? Very much like Stuart said, do we publish our learnings so that we can really build on each other's knowledge rather than individual groups doing these things really on a non-scalable basis? And I think that's a little bit the opportunity and the challenge we have. And Patient Open Engagement Forum is just one of these examples where we bring a lot of stakeholders together to take care of just that topic. If you want to move on to the next slide, here we go. So I saw, for instance, one conversation in the chat or one question. Here you see just a pie chart of stakeholders, right? We could add an infinite number almost of other stakeholders to this pie chart. And one of the questions was, well, how do I get in my country, the HTA or payers, to work with patients if they don't do that? And part of my answer to that would be, well, this is always a multi-stakeholder approach. Not one can move the system alone, but if you get several of the other stakeholders to talk with patient groups, I think it will become more and more difficult for one group not to do that. And I think part of forums like we have today, where we have a very kind of diverse audience and also panelists, help us get to this alignment and help us bring these stakeholders closer together. I think another piece that we all need to realize, certainly if I wear my industry hat for a moment, is this is not competitive, what we're doing here. This is really being in that together, delivering better outcomes for the system and for the community. And what we do with insights individually as companies is a different thing, right? That could become then proprietary. But all the standards, all the engagement, I think needs to be shared. I'm quoting Stuart again, and needs to be consistent and transparent, as Teresa said. Show me the next slide, if you could. So there's another piece which actually was picked up in an earlier talk of this final session already. So as we scale patient engagement, and there is a geographic aspect of that, there is certainly a stakeholder aspect of that, and there is just the sheer number of engagements and progress that's made. I think quality is of paramount importance here. Whether this is consistency, whether this is setting standards, whether this is fair payment. You see here we've made a little kind of pie chart of individual or some examples of quality aspects that we believe we need to drive now. We're at a stage where this is really growing exponentially. If you don't have the fundamental quality standards and alignment, I think it will still end up in a lot of insufficient activities that will not be scalable and certainly will create or demand redundant patient engagement, which we can't afford. So here's a plea to really increase the quality and watch it very carefully, both on the regional side, but perhaps also across borders if we can. So that would certainly be one example for Europe, where it's a bit easier perhaps, but the US are so big. So if you get the US and Europe well, and perhaps can embrace some of the other regions and then bridge across the Atlantic, that would be a major accomplishment, I feel. If I could have the next one. Very well. So here is a couple of snapshots which I believe are important as of today, where we want to really be mindful of so that we get to the next level. I already spoke about fragmentation. I think that's very clear. Whatever we can do to bring it together to be most effective will be very helpful. In the center of the slide, you see a new role for patient representatives. I think, as Teresa said, the demand has become so multifold and so diverse. I think we need to be very mindful how patients can engage best. Some, may be educated through your party or other ways. Some may, in inverted commas, just be lay patients. There's so many different roles, but I think we need to make sure all of them can be filled so that we can do that well. The third kind of box on the right-hand side is one that's also important to me. I've seen now a lot of entities do, if you want to use a word that's probably not so nice, tokenism. Basically saying I do engage with patients, but they really don't do it well, or they don't mean it, or they don't expect major consequences out of that. And I think we can't afford that. And so we need to make sure that does not happen. And I think my final kind of plea here is there's a need for capacity and capability building, harmonization and standards, as I said before. And my final slide is really something I invite you all to read. This is a quote of a real patient who I personally know, and I'll read it to you too, because I think this brings home why we're here today and why we do what we do. I'm included in a clinical study, which is good, but I'm in the arm without radiation. More and more research shows that local therapy by radiation is beneficial. So we decided to step out of the clinical study in the near future so that I can continue my current treatment plus radiation. That is the best possible treatment at this moment. So this brings home, I think, in a very direct way, if we don't design trials, if we don't think about what's really helping patients, and we perhaps put them into a substandard therapeutic arm, that's not going to be good for everyone. And again, I think this is the reason why we're here today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Tony, for pointing out some of the challenges and opportunities to really get at those challenges. And I think some of the questions that we have had, we have a few minutes to address some of the questions before we move on to hearing from those on the call. And I wanted to actually get at an earlier question that was posed to Teresa, but I think it's very much, it was reflected also in your comments, Tony, as well as Randall's comments. And this has to do with ensuring, also this was posed to the FDA, but I think you all probably will have some thoughts on this as well, but really ensuring that how we move forward with ensuring that standardization does not come at the expense of diversity. And like I said, this is, Teresa, if there are any thoughts that you want to offer there, I think that would be great as we look at the guidance that are being put out and, ICH. And as Randall said, representation is really key as we move forward. And the pandemic has really underscored some of the disparities that still exist. And as we move forward, we're being strategic in ensuring that we're not widening those. So Teresa, if you can start us off, and any of the speakers, please jump in as well.
Sure, thank you. Yes, I don't see, I suppose there could be a conflict between diversity and increasing access to everybody and standardization, which I think promotes quality, but I don't think there's necessarily a conflict between these things. And I think the standardization of the methods and tools actually will help to and reduce the cost, reduce the barrier of boutique methods and tools, which frankly are then harder for everybody later to figure out. This whole point of fragmentation and siloing, really that exacerbates the problem of a lack of access to those other more diverse populations and with all the characteristics that Randall talked about. Okay, so I see standardization of good methods, development of core sets. That doesn't mean that if you find a subpopulation has other things, there are other measures that matter to them, and a sponsor thinks that their therapeutic, or maybe their device could affect that you couldn't add that in. But having a standard set can be helpful in so many ways, including approval is just the first hurdle for a lot of patients. They've got to get coverage. They've got to get HTA. They've got to get payers to pay for it. So standardization lowers the learning curve for people and lowers barriers. And I think, and frankly, it even will allow us to move into, let's say, electronic measures that could be collecting more standardized data better, which really might allow us to move that into lay health records, electronic health records, move toward community-based trials and have a more diverse population in trials as well. So I think that, to me, done well, that there's no inherent conflict between standardization of a lot of these things and trying to achieve some of the other things we've talked about, including the themes of standard quality and sustainability. So I'll stop there. Obviously, I could take up a lot of time going on about this, but I'll stop there.
Any other remarks?
Yeah, in many ways, I think I would totally echo that. Mm-hmm. I think if you agree on certain principles, standards, however you want to call it, then I think it's much easier, much more scalable to be more inclusive, to allow more diversity. That could be actually one of the standards, mm-hmm. right? One of the guiding principles. And I think then you have a benchmark and you have to kind of meet that benchmark. So I do not see any contradiction either. If anything, I think there's synergy.
I would agree. I think you both captured that really well. I don't think there's necessarily a conflict. We've got a heightened sensitivity right now to diversity and inclusion and really addressing those gaps that have been so systemic and long lasting. So we'll have to bring that to the table in any kind of standards that are being crafted, and then also recognize that we will learn as those standards are applied in the real world, across the healthcare ecosystem, that maybe they will need to be adjusted. Maybe they'll need to be approved in some kind of regular cycle. As Teresa said, we'll learn from what we're getting back from that process, and we can react to it both to improve and adjust the standards if we need to, but then also look at other parts related to the standards as to what we're learning. So I think we are in a good place if we're just very aware of how this is an area that must be included in any of the thinking that we take forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think a follow-on question, but I'll maybe translate that into a comment, is the importance of not just identifying those standards and defining them, but also transmitting them. So disseminating and them for implementation. And I think this is one of the issues that we've seen in patient engagement, where there are a lot of resources and tools, but we don't see uptake of those really great tools, either for whatever reason, either because organizations are not aware of them, or they're created in silos, so they're not able to be kind of widely disseminated and used. And so to the point of the standards, someone mentioned the importance of transmitting those as well as we move towards standardization. One quick question before we move into hearing from the participants again. And this is the issue of capacity building in patient organizations. Like, Tony, in your remarks, one of your final slides, you talked about kind of the need for increasing capacity and the patient groups being central to this work. But how do we address, and one question came in, or a remark came in, about kind of the consistent or constant underfunding and under-resourcing that we see in patient groups. Do you have any thoughts for how we ensure that as we move forward, and using Tony's slides, the demand for patient engagement is increasing, how do we ensure that we are also empowering the patient community to effectively respond to that demand? I think part of that has to do with, streamlining engagement with them in a way to not overburden, but there is, even at a more basic level, just capacity building issues that need to be addressed. So any thoughts on that? Maybe we can start with you, Randall, since I know you probably heard a lot from your members.
We absolutely do. And actually, helping our patient groups be stronger and better across all these different areas is so critical to our mission. So I think you're right. I mean, patient groups are so well-intentioned, have such a critical role to play in support of patients, oftentimes serve as a bridge between formal systems and where patients live and experience their health. And so what we're looking to do is try to eliminate any reinvention, duplicating the wheel, if you will, so that patients groups can learn from each other's experience, give them as many tools and resources to implement these methodologies, benefit from this research on behalf of their patients. But I think we need an investment, and we need an investment from the stakeholder community, maybe those that have not traditionally been involved in this conversation, to understand that it's through these changes that we will really achieve a healthier society, one patient at a time. So I think it's a really good observation that patient groups, particularly coming through the pandemic, are strapped for resources, and yet patients are calling on them more than ever. These issues, what we're talking about here today, has got to be a part of a plan to help these patient groups be as strong as they can be on behalf of patients and with patients.
Absolutely.
So if I may add a few thoughts, and I'm trying to watch the chat, which is not so easy, but it's very clear, right? There's several aspects here. One is fundraising. It's as simple as that, right? Many patient groups are charities, so funding is key. And so, here is again a stakeholder contract that needs to happen. How can the funding occur, and deep plans need to be made in order to secure that. But there's other things other stakeholders in this area can do. So take PFMD as an example. Everything that's done in PFMD is public, is available to every single patient, individual patient groups, you tell me. Most of the things FDA does is available on the website. People can participate, people can come forward. Think about patient education opportunities. UPADI is available to many. So I think there's a lot of tools, a lot of instruments available, which is helpful. but at the same time, the funding is key, and I totally realize it. And I think there needs to be done more because there is this demand from many sides. Again, if we can't meet it because there's no fair market value for patients engaging and the likes, then there's an issue. And that's why we started to tackle things like what's fair market value compensation for patients, that there are no issues. So I think we're on the way, but this is imperfect. And I think that's just honest to state that at this stage.
You know, and I'm really glad that this came up because it's real. I mean, to do all the work that we've been doing together and to achieve the vision we've discussed today and not have that be picked up in all of the systems in and around patients would be such a loss, first and foremost to those patients. So I think we need to talk about investment and investment from both public and private sectors that have a stake in the health of our communities and the health of patients, again, beyond specific disease groups or the mandates of any one patient group, that would be a new source of funding to really bring these ideas and these methodologies into systems. And I'm ready to do that, even if those methodologies aren't fully cooked. Let's real world test them, beta test them, pilot test them in the systems that could then start to change. I think we can find some investors for that worthy cause.
So
Great.
I would come at this a little differently if there's time. I mean, everything that's been said, I completely agree with. But a different angle of this to me is, and one we see is, you know, patients' experiences and their data are a very valuable resource. And so in addition, and patients, basically most of the people who are active because there's an unmet need. I mean, and in the rare community, this is certainly the case, where people are desperate, they need an effective treatment and they don't have time to waste. And so another component of that to me is that we shouldn't let good data go underutilized. So and I think PFMD has tools here too. When patients participate in a study or they put together a registry or they're giving information, that gets used to the max, that it doesn't get, you know, buried like the control arm of a good study doesn't, you know, remain just within the files. Maybe a company could donate that to, you know, a data platform and really help leverage other studies and even work that they might do. So thinking of data as this really valuable resource that we should be using to the max. And again, that goes back to, I think, what Tony was saying in the pre-competitive, or maybe it was Steve, pre-competitive space, that we really try to maximize and think of this as resources to move drug development forward. Over.
Thank you all so much. We certainly will come back to some of the points that you raised, but I wanted to make sure that we have time to hear from everyone on this call. And so if we can go back to the group map link that you all used. So everyone on this call, the group map link that you used earlier to identify your stakeholder affiliation. If you don't have that, it is in the chat box as well. And what we really want to hear from you are just to understand from your perspective, the key or the priority issues that you think PEOF should focus on going into 2022. And so we've gone ahead and identified some of the bucket areas that we've covered, but also the speakers have mentioned as important areas that still need to be addressed. And we also have a final bucket for other, where you can enter any topics that do not fall into any of these buckets. And so please go ahead and enter your thoughts. We will be reviewing these very quickly, real time, as your results come in. And so actually we ask for two things. First of all, across these buckets, any specific issues or themes that should be covered by PEOF. And also if there are themes that others enter that you really feel very strongly about, go ahead and upvote them so that we can see the convergence in the themes. So let's spend about 5 to 8 minutes doing this, and we really hope that you all will be able to participate, because this is really where we get your input, and your input is able to shape the work that we do going forward. I see some responses coming in. If there are any problems, if anyone encounters any problems with accessing the link, or inputs in your themes, please let us know in the chat and we will address that. Whilst we wait for the responses to come in and for the themes to emerge, I wanted to actually go back to our speakers to talk about a couple other questions. And one of those, I think, picking up of where you ended, Teresa, with the issue of data and how data, maximizing the use of data. I think one of the key issues that we have heard over and over is barriers to data sharing, not just data collection, obviously, which is a key issue, and where the guidance that are being put out, as well as the resources that's being developed by the National Health Council will all help with that. But data sharing have there been substantial barriers to data sharing, and I wanted to ask all of you to just kind of share your thoughts on how we overcome that barrier to the extent so that we can effectively use existing data that we have, but also, as we go forward, removing some of the barriers. Someone mentioned, I think earlier on, we heard about the pre-competitive space. So let's reflect on that a little bit and think about, as we go forward with patients and patient communities, really providing their data, not that information not being kind of sitting in silos or in a competitive, kind of being used as competitive leverage, but being available across board. So how do we address barriers to data sharing?
So I don't want to go first all the time. Like if somebody else wants to answer, that's cool. If not,
I was going to ask if anyone is brave enough to start.
Okay, then I'll go first if nobody else picks up. As I said before, I think we have to, certainly from an industry perspective, clearly differentiate between what's competitive data and what's pre-competitive and what should be open access. And I would submit a lot of methodologies, publishing successes or even publishing failures in engagement that can be totally openly shared. I think what might become competitive, and I would totally be respectful if somebody said that, if you ask a certain patient group about what does not work about your drug and what needs to be tackled and what strategy should be deployed to make the drug better, I understand, right? That may be something which the company then needs to do a clinical study about and do it. But there is so many things that are non-competitive and should and can be shared. Mm-hmm. It just requires a little bit of conscious thinking. By the way, that's the foundation on which we built PFMD. And it was quite a journey for many people to understand sharing the knowledge, sharing the expertise has nothing to do with competition in this field. And that's a journey we all need to kind of be on.
Thank you. Any other comments or reflections from the other speakers?
I guess I can add something here, Ewo, that I think that I agree with what Tony said. Also just, I think that there's value downstream for pre-competitive sharing. And you probably also need to know, to break down the barriers, how can you share it? Are there organizations that are able to, safeguard or, be a good steward, if you will, of contributed data? So I'll give you an example of one that we think is pretty experienced with this at this point. We've been supporting for developing what we're calling a rare disease cures accelerator, because these problems are acute in the rare disease area. And that's a Critical Path Institute. And they've had a lot of experience, I think, with data sharing agreements with companies. And now they're engaging also with patient groups to bring in registry and natural history study data to standardize it, clean it, and really safeguard it. They have use agreements where they really are very careful about what level of use people are willing to allow, and companies, but you get access to all the other contributed data as part of that. So you really, in a way, there's the value proposition, if you will, for people engaging here, that the sum becomes greater than, I don't know what, I'm going to not even try to go there. I can't remember the expression, so I'm going to get it wrong. But it's really a very valuable thing as well. So I think that's another piece of it, maybe, to break down the silos. Over.
I would just build on Teresa's last statement. I also think that, for patients themselves, really understanding how data that is collected in trials, concerning, their experience is shared. And I think they would be excited to know that it's going to be shared in a way that would really enhance health for others. That's great. But addressing the trust issue, we're going to have to be able to explain how data is shared, really how this process works in a way that's very clear to patients, and patients see value to themselves and to others, so that they're not suspicious, or so there aren't gaps in their understanding of the process in a way, whether it's about data sharing or just what their experience is in a clinical trial. So that, and also so that it creates an understanding that leads to more people being willing to engage. So I think these points are really well taken. I also don't lose sight of the fact that we're focusing on drug development, medicine development, which is very specific. There are lessons for the larger health ecosystem, and really resources and methodologies and considerations that we're talking about here that would have value in many other settings as these medicines come to market and start to benefit patients. And I think we would be thinking then not so much as data sharing to drive medical development, or data sharing to only drive savings, but how can we best invest in a patient, understanding who they are, what they need, would be well served in many other parts of the healthcare journey.
Absolutely. And we are seeing some of the results converge. And we have about 58 out of the, about roughly 3/4 of the participants engaging in the group map activity. So thank you all so much for providing your perspectives. And let's take a look at some of the themes that are beginning to emerge. So if you look across the different buckets, the larger fonts indicate where people are kind of in agreement. So where the themes that have been upvoted. And I think probably some of these are not surprising, starting with the yellow bucket, diversity and patient engagement. We've talked a little bit about that. And here, there's definitely agreement around ensuring diversity in clinical trials and patient engagement, which is certainly something that we saw reinforced, an issue that we saw underscored, especially in the pandemic and testing for vaccines. And I think it's one that we continue to grapple with. And so that's been identified as an important issue. So looking across these buckets, let's see, are there any, like just looking at the top themes that are coming out, are there any specific themes that are surprising to any of you? So looking at the medtech bucket, for instance, and Stuart, I'll put you on the spot here. Widespread education for patients on positive implications of sharing health data through integrated health IT systems. What do you think about, like, how do we proceed with that? There's certainly a lot of need and call for engaging patients about how their data is being used, especially with these wearables where, frankly, I don't think a lot of people know where their data is going. All the data that's been collected about them is going, but the need to kind of engage in more patient education and ensuring that data is being used the way that patients think it's going to be used. Any thoughts about that particular theme, or any of the other topics that are coming up in the medtech bucket?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I guess it sort of builds off what sort of Teresa and Randall were saying about sort of the building of trust. And that goes, yeah, beyond the patient sort of engagement field to sort of the broader health sector. It's a bit of a minefield, really, from a sort of patient perspective, to really truly understand what data you're giving up, who owns it, and what they're doing with it. But also the other thing is I think we can learn from when we make assumptions about what is acceptable and what the patient or patient community thinks is acceptable. I think there's some very good examples from the UK where we've tried to sort of have mechanisms of opt-in or opt-out for sharing sort of, sort of health data, sort of primary and secondary care data for the greater good that could be utilized for research and so on and so forth. but in many cases, those assumptions have been wrong, and those initiatives have not gone down so well. So I think there's there's quite a lot of learnings that we need to be there. But yeah, the sort of trust and transparency bit, and just being very clear on what our assumptions are and making sure we test our own assumptions, I think is quite important there.
Absolutely.
If I might build on that, I think what we've learned as I've learned as a regulator, kind of a bureaucrat, I guess, that we get enormous benefit from listening to patients' perspectives and thinking of asking them about, well, what do they think about this? And because, I mean, and this is where I feel we've done a reasonably good job at somewhat in having patients feel okay telling us what they really think, which is not necessarily, it's not necessarily flattering or not. They're very candid with us, and it's very helpful to kind of hear if our assumptions are off, or if we're missing something, or we're communicating something that really is just not going to where their concerns are. So I think, along the lines of what Stuart was just describing, just talking to people more about their concerns, and the more we can kind of go have open discussion of listening to patients' concerns and perspectives. The chat here has got a lot of good stuff in it. I'm afraid we don't have time to cover it all. I want to say just a brief thing about the diversity in trials and engagement. And again, I'll reflect on something that we heard from patients. We in a meeting that we had on clinical trials and how to design them, and how are we using how are patients being engaged on their trial experience. And it had to do with some of the speakers we had from minority communities and from low-income communities in the US. And one real important takeaway from that was that the trials and the engagement needs to go to them. I mean, that you need to go to their community and not just visit, but be there. That, a presence and a persistent presence and hearing and understanding people, building trust with different communities is really key to the diversity. It's again, I think I'll go to maybe something on I think it was Tony's slide about token involvement, that we're not talking about token involvement here. We're talking about a long-term relationship. And that, we've found that the pandemic and digital communication and having to go virtual with our patient-focused meetings has actually improved participation, and we've been able to reach a lot more people who couldn't travel to Washington, and so, but really what we've, I think that's a thing I wanted to share, that just really taking the trials and taking the engagement to the communities and being there, I think is something that I think we're learning. Over.
Thank you very much, Teresa.
I was just going to say, that just so speaks to what I see a next step being, for example, in our patient experience mapping toolbox. So that's there on our website, and you should take a look at it. Primarily developed for researchers, so we can get researchers on board and doing the research that then is validated and speaks to the decision makers that would take that up. But our next rollout there would be to do some pilot testing with patient groups, including those that are serving minority or, marginalized populations, and really make sure that they could look at a tool like this and say, I can see how this would work or not work with our patients. And so I would encourage all of you to take a look at that patient experience mapping, because as Teresa said, if you listen, you will hear where there are disconnects or where you're really succeeding. And oftentimes what surfaces is not maybe what you would have expected. So I just really encourage people to stay on that path.
Well, I think that is a good place to actually transition. Thank you so much, Randall. And, we got so much great feedback in the group map activity. And this is feedback that I know PEOF is certainly going to take, process, and have kind of shape their priorities going forward. And so we really appreciate you all being involved and offering your perspectives this way. And I want to really thank our speakers today, and just for being so generous with your time and your expertise, and just for the work that you're doing as well in this space. Before we have a few minutes, and I wanted to actually turn it over to Valentina, who will be speaking on behalf of the PEOF team to offer some reflections on the year and kind of what they see coming up.
Thank you so much for having me at the end of the closing session of the PEOF 2021. I wanted to take the opportunity to thank everyone on behalf of PFMD, UPATI, and EPF for being with us over 2021. It was a difficult year, but we have been able to still organize really interesting and insightful discussions. And I wanted to just share a few figures because they were shared by PFMD in a tweet, and I thought this is really interesting to share, and it shows really the wealth of information, of ideas we have shared over the year. We had 16 sessions in 2021, but this means much more than just 16 sessions. We had more than 2,200 registrations from 5 continents. We had over 70 speakers. And so this shows that the engagement has been high throughout the year. I always believe that the PEOF audience is a loyal one. People like to come back and stay with us. So thank you for that. I'd like to take the opportunity to also thank all speakers and panelists that have been with us since the very first session in 2021. They have always shown a lot of interest in what we do and also really generously contributed to the discussions, as we have seen also in this last one. Thanks also to all the program committee members. Having you on board really allowed us to make sure that we would focus on the right topics and prioritize what is really burning out there in terms of patient engagement. And last but not least, we would like to thank all our sponsors because without them, this would have not been possible. Just a few words about the information that we have collected through Group Map today. All the topics we have shared will be considered for 2022 sessions, and the group map will be open till the 17th of December. So our intention now is to really capitalize on the wealth of ideas that we have gathered so far, and we will really consider them for next year. Maybe to also keep the excitement ongoing, I wanted to share that we are exploring the opportunity to have an hybrid sessions. So we are still discussing what the format could be, but the idea is really to come back to face-to-face meetings if COVID-19 will allow us. To conclude, PEOF has shown really to be an opportunity to co-create together. And often it is opportunities also to IMI projects to come on board and present the work they are doing and use the PEOF platforms to share new ideas and to see how the collected feedback could go back to the projects to further develop them. So we would like to keep this engagement with IMI and the future innovative health initiatives ongoing to really further inform the work that is going to happen in 2022 and beyond. Last but not least, PEOF is going really global. Already we have a lot of engagement from US, but our intention is to spread over other countries as well, also to bring the diversity of cultures we want to have in patient engagement. Last but not least, as a final word, when you want to co-create, don't forget about PEOF. We are the right platform to do that. So think of us when you have in mind a discussion that goes into patient engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentina, and thank you all. Just a quick reminder again that the group map activity is open until December 17th. So continue to just provide your input. Thank you to our speakers for your insights. Once again, thank you to all of you. I know you've all been engaged throughout the year and for staying on through to the very end to provide your perspective for the next year. And also thank you to the organizers for providing this platform for patient organizations to really learn from each other, to create and shape the agenda going forward. And so we look forward to a very robust and very active 2022, because there are a lot of issues that we want to move forward. So that's the end of this session. I wish you all a very happy holiday season. Be safe.